Hello and what is shaking, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Wind Up Podcast. I am your host, Mike Anderson of MTGA Wines, and we are here following up on that blending episode that we posted a couple of weeks back. It has been now a little bit more time since we finalized some of those blends. We've gone back through and tasted through some of our current releases, these new wines that are going to be coming out, as well as the 2023s, the future wines that will start getting ready for bottling next year. And I wanted to provide a little bit of insight and hopefully kind of like a vintage update for you all, and also just kind of the idea of where I think these 2022s from Napa and Northern California are going to go, and kind of where 2023 is as a vintage as well. Because blending these 2022s was probably the hardest blending session that I've done in 15 years of making wine. It was something that was very challenging, and we'll go ahead and get into that in a little bit more detail. That blending episode a couple weeks back had already kind of run pretty long, so I didn't want to dive into this thought and this kind of go down this avenue at that time, but I figure now to break it off and kind of do its own episode is a good way to go about it. So before we get into it, thank you all once again for liking, sharing, subscribing, listening to the show, downloading it. Please continue to subscribe if you haven't had a chance yet, wherever you are consuming your podcast, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever the case may be. Please give us that follow. Be sure to rate and review the show if you have a chance. That really helps out with the algorithm and kind of getting it out there into the airwaves. And be sure to follow us on our social network at MTGA Wines. That is going to be where you can find kind of more regular updates, including, announcements for new episodes of the show. We're most active on Instagram as well as YouTube, where you'll find a lot of short videos and tasting notes and all kinds of other cool stuff. You'll also find us on the Book of Face and the social network formerly known as Twitter, but we're a little less active on those. So, but be sure to hit like, subscribe, follow, all the things. That way we can keep in touch. You can also find out more about MTGA Wines and what we do at mtgawines.com. It's a little bit more information about the wines we produce, the styles, kind of our wines by the numbers, how they're made. All kinds of cool information can be found there as well. So you can also subscribe to that newsletter for more regular wine updates kind of around the year. All right, without further ado, let's get into how this 2022 blending session really shook out. Now, for those that haven't gone and listened to that blending episode where we're out in the cave, highly recommend doing so if you're interested in kind of the thought process of how I craft a wine. And I think how many winemakers will, attempt to craft a wine. We definitely take a lot of time to try and go through that process. It's something that we try to be very, very diligent about. We're constantly trying prior vintages, the next vintage that we're going to be bottling, and even stuff that's still in barrel for future vintages to kind of make sure that it's still falling within the same realm. And the reason we do that is simply for consistency. It's like going to the store and, buying a Pepsi, right? If you buy a Pepsi, but it tastes like something else, you're like, oh, this isn't what I was expecting. There's some sort of brand recognition or style. In the wine industry, we call it our house style that we try and achieve year in and year out. That, when you buy a bottle of a certain winery's wine, then you kind of know what you're going to get. Knowing full well that many of us focus on kind of the artistic side of winemaking, yeah, there's probably going to be some subtle variations. It might not be exactly the same year in and year out, but the way I describe it is we want these wines to be, in essence, a new chapter in the same book, right? It's telling the same story. You're continuing along some sort of theme, but at a certain point, you need those chapters to be different to continue that story. You can't just read the same thing over and over and over again and get anywhere. So the evolution of a winery and its house style, in my opinion, is something that's achieved kind of year after year as you're continuing to evolve and adapt to the conditions that Mother Nature is providing you and trying to build consistency with, that crazy variable in nature that you just can't really control. There's a lot of other things you can, but that is a big thing that we just can't quite do yet, as it turns out. Surprise, surprise. So there are other kind of tricks of the trade, such as blending a wine, that can allow us to help kind of build that consistency. Excuse me, for some reason we're feeling a little raspy today. I do have my trusty cup of coffee to help, keep things clear and myself alert and awake. Longtime listeners to the show, that whenever there's a pause break, you know that I'm just injecting more caffeine into the system. That's how it works on this episode, or on any episode for that matter. So, with all the, with that kind of theme of consistency in mind, when you have a challenging year like 2022, which I'm not going to say it's the most challenging year I've ever experienced. It certainly was interesting having this crazy heat spike in September where it's, well over 100 degrees, pushing 115 for, 5 days straight. On either end of that, you still had days in the triple digits in the high 90s, just a crazy heat spike. Right when we really didn't want it to happen. It was just the worst case scenario as far as like heat waves go. But again, that's nature. We can't control it. You see it on the horizon, and you have to do the best you can with what you got. Now, we've talked a little bit about the 2022 vintage and that big weather event in the past, but just as a quick recap, when you see something like that on the horizon, you basically have three options. One, you try and get your grapes in before it. That way you kind of mitigate that entirely. You don't have to worry about it. Two is maybe your fruit's not quite ready just yet, and you think you can weather the storm a little bit, but maybe you harvest over the course of that week. That way, you're not harvesting as early as you necessarily have to. You can kind of split the difference a little bit. And then the third option is to wait and see. And for a lot of the wines we are producing, and I think for many, many people, is that our fruit just wasn't ready yet. And we could either make mediocre wine for sure by harvesting way earlier than we wanted to, or we could wait through this heat wave and kind of hope for the best. And I think that's where a lot of us hung our hat. And, frankly, I think there are a certain amount of producers that panicked and they said, oh, we just got to get everything in. And you have wines that are subpar as a result because they jumped the gun. That's just my own 2 cents. Based on what I've tasted. I'm not trying to call anybody in particular out, but based on conversations amongst colleagues and friends in the industry, we know what those challenges are. We know when it's really tough to make good wine, and we know when we've put ourselves behind an 8 ball. We're very open and honest about that behind closed doors because, we still have to sell these wines. So very rarely does this information actually make it out into the public. But we talk about this stuff all the time as an industry of how challenging a certain year is and kind of what we're doing to mitigate it. Because you have to find a way, over, under, around, through it as best you can. But when you make that kind of executive decision of when to harvest, that sends a bunch of other things in motion, right? Of how that style of wine or how that wine and its style is going to be impacted over the long run of aging. And eventually when you come down to this blending that we did over the last couple of weeks. Now, very typically, about 3 months before a bottling run, I do a preliminary blending session. This is something that I do specifically. I know other winemakers check in on blends kind of as years go on. They're tasting barrels and kind of figuring out what's going to go where, but it's very much a rough draft. We're simply just trying to have a good idea of kind of where we might need to push certain blends to figure out exactly where we want them to be to achieve, our house style that we've been talking about. So we did that about 3 months ago. And then last week, we finalized the remainder of our 2022 blend. So 2 weeks ago, we did that Repechage red blend through that blending episode in the cave. And over the course of the last week or two, we finalized our Cabernet, 2 different Merlot bottlings, another Cabernet bottling. There's one more in there. And our Cabernet Franc. We finalized a bunch of other wines outside of that. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of tasting wine, the real rough part of the job, but it has to be done in order to maintain this house style. The thing that made blending the 2022s so damn difficult was that the preliminary blend that I put together 3 months ago simply got thrown out with the bathwater. It basically meant nothing. It was still a good exercise, but this was the first time that I can remember that I've done that, and I've had to completely overhaul all of the blends that we were talking about. Even the only real exception to that was the red blend, which surprisingly enough is typically the more complicated wine to put together because you're pulling Merlot, Cab Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, a bunch of different barrels, new oak, once used oak, neutral oak barrels. I mean, there's so many variables that you assume like, all right, we're really going to have to fine tune and kind of tweak this as time goes on. But it kind of settled in. It just, that blend for some reason, and I think very luckily, it kind of was just lined up to knock it down, which was amazing. It was amazing. Absolutely amazing. But then I sat down and I kind of did this backwards, and this might be kind of my own damn fault, is that normally I blend our Merlot first. It's typically the wine that we do first because it's what we're known for. After that, we do our Cabernet Sauvignon because that's kind of next up in the lineup. And then the red blend is kind of that great ace up our sleeve where it's like, hey, we have these other barrels that we've kind of pushed that direction. Maybe we can add a little bit more to that through blending and kind of bolster, the volume of that we're actually going to bottle up. Having started with the red blend and kind of knowing what I needed for that this year, I might have painted myself into a corner. It doesn't really feel that way, but in hindsight, it's like, yeah, I kind of messed with my MO. And it may have made this more challenging, but we'll see. I don't think that that's entirely the case, but that is certainly a thought that went through my head. What was more interesting, I think, was just the fact that all of the preliminary blends that I tried to put together, they just didn't work. They didn't jive. They were just, if you listen to that blending episode back on July 10th, there were a couple of those blends that just like we tried kind of live as we were doing that session, and they just didn't work. They didn't jive all that well. It was just like, oh, well, like that's fine. Like they were good. They're all right, but nothing to write home about, certainly. And immediately they were just kind of discarded. They just didn't work. Sometimes you throw stuff at the wall and it just, it just doesn't work. And that's what happened with the Merlot. Even our single barrel Merlot was really, really wonky. Our Cabernet certainly needed some work. The only other thing that really was kind of lined up to knock it down was our Diversum, a second label that we've started over the last year or so. That one got put together pretty well, but even then it still kind of like needed a little something. And when that happens, you go and recreate those and it's just not working, it's like, well, back to the drawing board. So, that hour-long blending episode that we posted on the 10th became all of a sudden like a full day of tasting wine and putting blends back together to try and figure out, hey, how is this actually going to come together to make sense? Because we've already ordered, all the materials for this bottling run. We're about a month out. If we're going to make any changes, we got to start doing that like right now. Otherwise, we're going to be really up a creek without a paddle because we're just going to not have the materials that we need to kind of like make this stuff happen. So that became a bit of a point of contention as well. It's like, hey, we are on the clock here, and it is ticking down really, really fast. In fact, even this morning as I'm recording this, we had a call with our glass supplier just to confirm the last few kind of minor details, right? So we go back through these blends, and I think very similar to some of my colleagues, the issues that we're seeing are very reminiscent of this heat wave that we experienced. You have wines that are a little bit more alcoholic. The alcohol content certainly higher on average for our wines because of the additional heat. There's a lot of dehydration, extra raisining out there, a higher concentration of sugar in those grapes as a result, and that converts to more alcohol when you ferment our wines dry and to be sugar-free. That sugar is basically gone. It gets converted to alcohol as well as heat and carbon dioxide and things. So, but the alcohol content is certainly higher. Now, the nice thing about the wines is they weren't super like jammy or raisiny. Like they didn't get too like overripe. They were still in like a good spot. The acidity was still there. There's some great tannin. There's good backbone to it. But a lot of them felt like donut wines. And what I mean by a donut wine is that like the middle of it, just there's no core to the wine. Like it tastes good up front, and then it just kind of like there's nothing, and then it like there's a finish, but it's just like there's it's missing like the presence. It doesn't quite have like the there kind of mentality that you want. And it was like, all right, well, we got to find that somehow, some way. And the end result was we ended up, we ended up blending into what's going to be a little bit more Cabernet than we normally would. The red blend is also going to be a little bit of a larger lot this year, and the Merlot is actually going to be quite a bit smaller than we normally do because the bulk of that is getting used for blending purposes. And it's something that's happened before, but between the Cabernet Franc and the Merlot, like we needed those wines and some of those lots to like hold the others together. Like the lots that we had initially created, the preliminary blends that I put together, like they just kind of tasted like they were falling apart at the seams. There just wasn't enough holding them together. So what we settled on was, I think the final blend for the Cabernet ends up having maybe about like 6 or 7% Cabernet Franc in it. The Merlot is still 100% Merlot, but it's only coming from a couple of barrels. We do have our single barrel that we set aside. Everything else is going into the red blend. It's kind of the catch-all this year because it's actually tasting really, really great with all those other components because they just didn't fit into our other wines, which is typically what our red blend is. It's an amalgamation of kind of these base wines that we create through, a specific barrel program and certain lots that we create very early on. We're talking during harvest and through the fermentation process and pressing into certain barrels. That's how we kind of get that wine started. But there's always other things that we add to it at this stage when we're getting ready to bottle. And the reason we try and add those things in terms of these other wine lots is because they don't fit into things like our Cabernet. They don't fit into things like our Merlot. And that's when we feel as though we need to make some of these kind of executive blending decisions to make sure that, one, the wines from this vintage are representative of this vintage, but also our brand. They represent our house style. And that if you taste our wines kind of year after year after year, when you get to the 2022s, you're going to know what you're in for to a certain extent. But they will also have some uniqueness to them because of the challenging growing season that we had. Now, it's interesting when you run into this wall as a winemaker, because even now, a couple weeks later, I'm still slightly second guessing my thought process. And luckily, there's still time to make some changes to these blends, even up to like the day before bottling, surprisingly enough. And this is kind of where we have to check our work. And I'll get into that here in a second. But it was a very interesting conversation I had with one of my best friends and a winemaker that I respect immensely, David Tate, up at Barnett Vineyards. And we were actually tasting I believe it was his Spring Street Cabernet under his own label, Tate Wines, which if you are into wine and haven't had Tate, you need to go check it out. Highly recommend those wines, and Barnett for that matter. He's a killer, very talented dude, and those are just amazing wines out here. But we're tasting this barrel sample and kind of his final blend of the Cabernet that he produces under the label Tate Wines. And, this is the stuff we were talking about. Like, hey, the blends were kind of tough to put together. We had this really ripe, bordering, like we're towing the line against overripe year. The acids for us still kind of hang in, so there's still this nice backbone to it. The tannins there. But was interesting, his solution for it, and actually we kind of found this with some of our 22s as well, is that they ended up bottling up some wines with a little bit higher percentage of new oak than they normally do. And what that does typically is you're going to have obviously more of those, vanillas and chocolate and mocha and toasty, woody, baking spice kind of characteristics. It can give the wine a little bit more oomph. It can also help fill that gap that we have in a donut wine a little bit, right? It can add a little bit more flavor and complexity to it to make sure that you're getting a full-bodied, fully flavored like wine, basically. And it was a great solution because his wine tasted like a Tate wine should. It's what I would expect. I've been drinking his wines for years. I know what they taste like. It was very reminiscent of his wines, but you knew it was representative of 2022 because it was a little higher octane, it was a little richer, there's a little bit more new oak on it to help kind of balance the wine out. But that's what you would expect. That's what you would expect. And that's really where we had to hang our hat as well, is that even our Napa Valley Merlot, our red blend, and our Cabernet, all of them needed like a touch more new oak to kind of help balance out these really big wines. And it was something that helped immensely. It was a great like ace up our sleeve of like, hey, we kind of have these lots readily available to us. You know, this wasn't done last minute. We've had these barrels aging in the cellar. And typically, you know, when certain barrels, you know, they might go on average into certain wines, but every once in a while you have a year like this where I'm like, you know what, I got to pull 30 gallons out of that barrel. I got to take half of that barrel and I need to get that into our red blend, because without it, the red blend's not good enough. Or we need to say, hey, we normally blend Merlot into our Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's such a juicy kind of ripe vintage. We need that Cab Franc. It's a little bit more structured. It's a little bit more intense, and it's going to get our Cabernet where we want it to go. And because Merlot is just not going to do it for us this year. It's just not going to. So, you know, there are these blending decisions that kind of come down the pipeline. And I got to tell you, even like talking through this right now is giving me a lot more confidence in some of those decisions. Because, you know, in the moment as you're sitting down tasting through just a plethora of wines, nay, a cornucopia of wines, right? Like you're tasting and tasting and tasting. You're going through all of these barrels, and then you're having to try and blend them in certain amounts. And you're like, all right, that's pretty good. Now let's try it with this selection. And then let's, you know, you A, B, C, D test this thing into oblivion, basically, to make sure that your wine's going to be what you want it to be. And it's almost like death by a thousand cuts. Like at a certain point, you're just like, oh my God, like, is this actually, you know, you start having that thought. And this is something I might have mentioned in that blending episode, is that at what point is this wine just different? You know, is it actually better than the previous blend I've been experimenting with? Or am I actually making a better wine? Or is it just different? And because it's different, it's unique and it stands out. And when a wine ends up tasting different, that's when you go back and you try the prior vintage and you're like, okay, does this actually, you know, jive with what we've done in the past? Does this still align with our house style? And it was a very, very full day of going through all these wines, trying them, and then double checking, then actually creating all those blends, sitting them down on a table. So we had our Merlot, single barrel Merlot, our red blend, our Napa Cabernet, and our Diversum Cabernet all lined up. And I tasted through every single one as kind of like we call it a horizontal tasting, whenever you taste through kind of all the wines in a lineup, rather than a vertical tasting, which is different years of the same wine. So if you taste, you know, the 19, 20, 21, 22 of like our Napa Cabernet, you're tasting a vertical of the Napa Cabernet. If you're trying the entire range of our program, like this lineup was, then you're tasting the horizontal, so to speak. I don't know who came up with that terminology, but that's how we do it. And tasting across all those, you're like, okay, now we got to make sure. Then the issue really became, actually, this was kind of the big issue, was we got all those done, and I'm sitting there, and the red blend was solid, the Cabernet we sorted out, the Diversum was set and ready to go. The Merlot and the single barrel Merlot were the pain in my ass this time. And the reason is we wanted to use, I mentioned a little bit more of that new oak in the Merlot to kind of give the Napa Valley Merlot just a little push over the edge. The problem was the more new oak that we added to it, the more it tasted like the single barrel Merlot. It was still different. And for me, I could pick out that difference. But it would be tough to do for someone who, no offense to casual wine consumers out there, but it would be tough to distinguish the two if I poured them side by side for you as like a blind tasting. Be like, pick out the one that's different. You know, are these different or are they the same wine? They were very, very similar. And it was like, okay, well, that's not going to work because the single barrel Merlot is always kind of the standout, most complex, most intense Merlot. But because this is such an intense vintage, there are a lot of wines in the cellar that are like big and bold and sexy and whatnot. Not just this one this year. So it came down to, all right, we got to actually figure out this Merlot thing. And that's when we started toying with using a little bit more Merlot for the red blend and saying like, hey, maybe we can use maybe half of this barrel for the red blend and maybe keep the Merlot where it's at and still have something that's really great and different and unique than everything else in the lineup. And so we just started moving those pieces around. You know, we weren't really playing chess with the wines. It's more like checkers. You're just like moving pieces around the board, you know, hoping to jump the next one and get to the next space. And I think we found a pretty good solution. You know, we settled on making a little bit less Merlot, keeping the single barrel Merlot where it's at, because of course it's a single barrel, you know, try and bottle that lot all up together. The red blend turned out to be, I think it was 42% Merlot, 40% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 18% Cabernet Franc is where we settled on that guy. The Cab Franc did a lot of heavy lifting for us this year. And then, yeah, the Napa Cabernet is going to be, it's going to be about 7% Cabernet Franc. There's going to be is it 1 or 2% Merlot? I should have brought my notes with me. I didn't. I failed. Should have brought my notes with me. 1 or 2% Merlot, just to kind of help round it out a little bit. And then the rest is going to be Cabernet Sauvignon. So you're talking about, 92%, 91% Cabernet Sauvignon when it's all said and done for the Napa Cab. It took forever to sort that out. And it just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You're trying all these wines and you're like, all right, I would get up, walk outside, get some fresh air, grab a drink of water, extra cup of coffee, come back in and be like, all right, let's try these one more time. And then again and again and again. And they finally got there. Ugh. It's by far the toughest and most annoying blending session I've done. That blending episode, as fun as that was, and hopefully provided some great insight into how these wines come together in our cellars out here in Napa, it definitely didn't do the process 100% justice because it was a complicated year to put together because the wines are just feisty and they're different and we're trying to maintain house style. And it was a year that it was tough to do that. The wines, however, have turned out fantastic. I'm very happy with where these final blends finally landed. It took a lot more effort than I thought it was going to, but still very reminiscent of what to expect. And I think this is something that you're going to find with many producers. Based on, conversations amongst colleagues out here, this is kind of what we're finding, is that the 22s have been kind of a pain in our ass over the last couple years of aging, but they're very good in their own right. And that's largely for those that decided to pick during or after that heat wave. I think a lot of the people that were in trouble or shaking in their boots a little too much and harvested before that heat wave, I think they're the ones that are going to have some problems. They're going to be very restrained. The wines are going to be a lot greener. I tell you what, if you love good Bordeaux, you're going to love, 2022 from some of these producers that harvested a little earlier than average. I think that's going to be a really, here's looking at the glass half full kind of mentality, right? Now, it's interesting when you have I guess for us, it makes it really interesting having this kind of anomaly of a year of 2022 with a big old heat spike outside of what was a very beautiful growing season otherwise. And then you have a 2021 before it, which was a little bit lower yielding or average yields, but just amazing quality. 2021 is still my front runner for vintage of the decade, kind of bar none. Those wines are just absolutely fantastic. It's going to be a very tough year to beat, and I think we can say that pretty objectively. There's a lot of hype surrounding 2023, last year's harvest. I think those wines still have some time to go before we can make that kind of assumption of them. It was a beautiful growing season last year, something that really played into our hands as wine producers. We could really slow play the season. However, because it was so cool last year, very much the opposite of what we had in 2022, there are a lot of producers that couldn't quite get their fruit where they wanted it to go. So you have a year in 22 where it was like, oh man, like we're getting either way early or we're way late and things are underripe or they're overripe, and it's tough to find that in between. And then you have 2023 as a year where it's much cooler, and like there's just kind of this, luckily for us, it plays into our hands in terms of our house style, but for many, I'm curious to see if we see some more kind of like underripe tones from people that maybe didn't quite get to where they wanted to go. I mean, it is one of my own little pet peeves of Napa that folks have tended to opt for longer and longer hang times and kind of fixing wines that have issues of over ripeness and lower acidities in the cellar, with additives and extracts and things, and concentrates. But, to each their own. That's fine. But for those people that normally do that, those wines didn't necessarily get there in 23. I think 23 has just some amazing potential to be very, very beautiful. I don't think it's going to quite have the concentration or depth that 2021 had to offer. Because 2021 was, I think, a very typical growing season for us. It was something that it was perfect. It was a very stress-free kind of harvest. 2022 is the opposite, and 22 was kind of the opposite of that, obviously, with the heat wave that we've been talking about. And 23, it's just yet to be seen. These wines are young. There's still a long way to go with them. And I don't know, there's some great stuff, but it's fewer and far between. Like there was a lot of wine made in 2023, big yields. But from what we're seeing, I don't know. There's still something. They still need to kind of show where they're headed. The 23s are kind of still this. They're floating in space. They're still a little discombobulated, trying to figure out which way is up. And they taste good, but they're going to need a little extra push to get over the edge to even be remotely considered like a vintage of the decade type wine. There's a lot of hype post the harvest last year. Regarding 23 and how good it was going to be. I haven't quite seen that just yet, haven't tasted that just yet. The wines are fabulous, don't get me wrong, but they certainly are not outshining where 2021 was. That's just my own 2 cents, I suppose. Man, between these last 3 years, and now that we're basically a month and a half away from harvest kicking off for us again, it has been a very interesting series of seasons that we've had. Going back the last 5 seasons, between 2020, the fire season that we had to endure, amongst the pandemic, 21 being just absolutely rock star, 22 throwing us that heat wave, 23 being cool and rainy, 24 kind of off to a very good start with some heat, but not staying super, super hot except for one heat spike that we've had, but it happened pretty early in the season. So we should be okay. Shouldn't be an issue. We just don't want to see that happen again during harvest. Please, thank you. That would be great. It's been just a crazy few years. I mean, it's always crazy. It's farming. There's always something nutty kind of going on. It's rare that we have a 2021 that is a kind of like line it up to knock it down kind of vintage. There's always something. There's always a curveball somewhere in there that you have to deal with. We'll see what this season has to offer. I think the challenge of putting together the 2022s is something that everyone's experiencing. I think 2023 is going to offer some of the same challenges because people couldn't get to the ripeness levels that they typically desired. And man, I think kind of the pomp and circumstance of most recent vintages, the 21s are kind of getting left in the dust a little bit, which is a shame because those are probably going to be some of the best wines that this decade has to offer. So if you haven't had any 2021 from Napa lately, it's time to go and start stocking up because it is just lights out. The wines are so good, so impossibly good. Very worth having in your cellar. Oh, and man, it is going to be just interesting. We're in this weird mode now where as we put together these final blends, whether it's super, super difficult to put them together like it has been for many of us putting together our 22s for bottling this season, or just looking back on the last couple of years and being like, man, can't believe harvest is almost here again. Let's see where this goes. We're just over here chasing that dragon, seeing if we can't catch it and make some great wine again. It's going to be another very interesting season, and we're here for it. Whatever curveball gets thrown our way, we'll foul it off and wait for the next pitch because we're just going to wait for that hanging fastball or slider or whatever right over the plate, and we'll knock it out of the park like we normally do. You know what I mean? Okay. I think that's all I got. This blending session weighs heavily on my mind because of how challenging it was. In comparing it and the season that it came from with some of the other seasons around it, some of the other wines that have been made over the last couple of years, I'm very curious to see how these 22s hang on, kind of where they go long term, and how they're received by the likes of you all, who are the wine lovers out around the country and the world that are into Napa wine. I think we are very, very excited for where they're going to be. I think we are anxiously awaiting your feedback as well once we start finally getting these wines out and about. Even some of our own 2022s will start making their way out this fall, as a matter of fact. So it won't be long before we start seeing some of them out and about. And I'm very curious to see how everything continues as these wines evolve over the next few weeks, months, years into the future. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. Again, please be sure to like, subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you're consuming your podcast. Follow us on all of our social networks. That's at MTGA Wines. For more regular updates, you can also go to our website, mtgawines.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter. Scroll down to the bottom of our homepage. Actually, too, there's a nice little form that you can fill out if you would like to start submitting questions for our July question and answer episode. That is going to be coming up in just one short week. On July 31st, we will have our Q&A episode for the month going out. So if you would like your question featured, be sure to slide into our DMs or submit a question through our website, and we'll try and get it featured here on the show for you. All right, that's all I got. You all have an amazing rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next week here on the Wind Up Podcast. Cheers.